This is a Parsha that, as we've looked at over the week, it presents incredible challenges. The notion of war, the ethics of warfare, the treatment of captives of war, specifically women. The Torah is advanced for its time and complicated in our own. My son has been watching recently Game of Thrones. He didn't watch it when it was happening, but now he is. And I find it to be remarkable how these parshiot, these Torah portions, really resemble the grittiest, most graphic of some of the violence in the Parsha, um, and in the show. It's not to say that the Torah is gratuitous in its violence, but it reflects a world of tribes that are fighting for survival, fighting from a sense of scarcity, and fighting in the name of a God who they believe will only love some of us, doesn't love all of us equally, and maybe loves all of us, but takes turn treating us as the chosen ones. In fact, if that sounds strange to you because we are God's people and we're about to enter our land, that is how Deuteronomy speaks about the land of Israel and the Israelites, how important it is for us to understand that Deuteronomy also says when you enter the land, you have to act properly and obey God's instructions. If you don't, the land will vomit you out, which means our staying on the land is conditional upon our ethical actions, and that is one of the reasons that Moses feels such urgency in everything that he's saying these weeks. All of the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, is the final 3 weeks of Moses's life, and he speaks with urgency of of someone who knows that their days are numbered, hoping that we will get it right, hoping we will endure in the land that God has promised. So for today, I want to look at one of the rules, which of course strikes us as radical and proper and ethical. The rule is, and this is Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 16 and 17. I'll just read the English. Don't deliver a slave to his master if he seeks refuge with you. Rather, allow him to reside among you, wherever he chooses, within any of your cities where it is good for him. You shall not oppress him. Linked to our own story of Exodus and redemption from Egypt through Sinai, receiving Torah, crossing the sea, and entering the promised land, is a recognition that freedom is not a given. We required God's miraculous delivering for our own freedom. And so when someone escapes slavery and finds their way to you, the Torah tells us explicitly, do not return them to their master. They can reside anywhere they want, which is good for them. Do not oppress them. And do not oppress them is language that we understand because we may never oppress the stranger. We were strangers in a strange land. That appears 36 times in the Torah. Clearly, it's an essential part of a Jewish identity, a Torah-connected identity. And the social contract of person to person means that no matter what their status had been, if they find their way to you, you are to honor their dignity as a child of God, deserving of freedom. Now, I've been looking at a comment by my dear friend and teacher and undergrad classmate, actually, Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay. She is the associate dean at the rabbinical school at the Jewish Theological Seminary at JTS. And she points to this verse and then reflects. This was a few years ago that she wrote this commentary on the life and journey of Frederick Douglass, who, with help from his soon-to-be wife Anna Murray Douglass, escaped slavery in 1838. And he became an active abolitionist and preacher, and his language reflected a relationship with the United States that is complicated, as any relationship with any nation truly is. But when someone has been enslaved within the confines and the legal traditions of a country, how can they feel patriotism? So his language was, I have no love for America as such. I have no patriotism. I have no country. What country have I? The institutions of this country do not recognize me as a man. That's part of his speech, Country Conscious and the Anti-Slavery Cause, an address delivered in New York City, May 11th, 1848. And so he had to assert his own dignity in the face of cultural oppression. And that's clearly not only the situation of one individual, nor was it limited to pre-Civil War Southern states. In fact, one of the most important books I've ever read was the last one written by Martin Luther King Jr., called Where Do We Go From Here?, where he analyzes the progress that was made in the southern states. He said, but the North got worse. The big accomplishment of the civil rights movement of the 60s was that never again would there be an election in the southern states, the former slave-owning states of the United States. Never again would there be an election that didn't take into account the black vote. That was a revolution that was accomplished by the civil rights movement in the 60s, but that wasn't an accomplishment in the northern states, nor can we actually claim that racial justice has been accomplished despite the election of the first black president in America. There's so much to say, and so I know that that's not all contained in the verse, but the verse calls into question things like the Fugitive Act, the Fugitive Slave Act, that was passed by the United States, and decisions by the United States Supreme Court that called for the return of slaves that had escaped, enslaved people that had escaped. And so when the Torah says, no, do not deliver a slave to his master if he seeks refuge with you, rather allow him to reside among you, wherever he chooses, within any of your cities where it is good for him. You shall not oppress him. So this is what Rabbi Ruskay writes. She writes something really beautiful. Not only do we learn to protect a slave who has escaped and to offer refuge, we also learn about prioritizing the dignity of those in our debt. We are told that when we go to collect the debt, we should wait outside, aiming to prevent the debtor from feeling any shame about their home, a feeling to which many of us can relate now when Zoom meetings show off our homes for everyone. And that's those of us who have Zoom. We took for granted over the last 2.5 years our ability to interact with each other, but what about people who did not? What a different experience they have had during the time of the pandemic. The vulnerable of our society has not gotten better during these years. Inequality has grown, and what is clear in the years since George Floyd's murder, is that we have so many more issues to address than we ever were willing to acknowledge before. The censoring of books in America is growing, and the banned books lists include anything that make us feel uncomfortable. And by us, I mean people who pass as white, and even those of us who are not white, who have succeeded. It is possible to relegate the impurity of American pasts because we are just interested in what comes next, except Dr. King's question really was the question. Where do we go from here? The Torah tells us that when someone was in a vulnerable position and finds their way to us, we can never ever allow them to return to the vulnerability of their former state. We at UJA are invested in helping lift people to a place where they can lift themselves, supporting the vulnerable people through hubs in Queens and in Brooklyn, supporting food pantries and working on food insecurity, survivors of domestic violence, and helping in Israel those who are part of what we would probably call marginalized societies. So this is the question that Rabbi Ruskay asks, and I hope that we hear it and we don't answer it quickly, as if we know. She says, despite the Torah's clarity, I'm struck by the ways upholding these laws would not have been simple. Going back to our first example, I contemplate how a Jew would have made sense of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which required slaves to be returned to their owners regardless of whether you lived in a slave or free state. It even required the government to take responsibility for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. What would you do if you had encountered a slave who escaped? As a Jew, your master story reminded you daily you'd been enslaved and freed, but as a Jew, you also had a religious principle that we follow the law of the land, Dina de Malchuta Dina. a law requiring you to return the slave? What if you worked for the government and were doubly bound to seek out fugitives and return them? Friends, this is really, really relevant. This is very current. Our work is clearly directed towards this specific idea, which is when there's a vulnerable person in your community, and there's no community without a vulnerable person, what is our obligation? We do not leave them as they are. We wonder what our obligation is, and then we get moving. This is how Rabbi Ruskay ends her comment, and with this we'll end ours. We may like to believe about ourselves that of course we would have protected the slave who had escaped, but we must ask ourselves, what are we doing today? Because however we are personally grappling with and addressing racial injustice today is probably a lot like how we would have reacted then. May we be blessed to make good and necessary trouble that will allow us to tell our children and grandchildren that in this time of reckoning, we helped ensure that freedom from oppression for all people is real. Friends, sending you all love and the wisdom of my dear friend, Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay. Linda, so glad to be with you in the north of Israel, in Akko. May we actualize this vision, friends. May we take to heart this part of the Torah. May we really study our history and be brave as we face the wounds of this nation that it has inflicted and that it continues to contain. May we heal and be healed. Let's sing our way into a good day. Ya la 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 la, diddy ya la la la, diddy ya la 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 la, ay ay la la la, ay la 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 la, diddy ya la la la, diddy ya la 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 la, ay ay la la la. Friends, see you tomorrow. Have a beautiful day.